Post-traumatic stress is not a disorder. It's an injury that can be healed. Each week on the Life After PTSD, podcast stories are told of counselors and clients who are creating a new normal of their choosing, truly free of trauma and PTSD. Listen for yourself on iTunes and all major platforms by searching Life After PTSD.
Looking to take your sports knowledge to the next level? Just a fan of wrestling and entertainment? You're in the right place. Welcome to The Show with your hosts, Hollywood JDT and Stuntman Kirk.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new edition of The Show. I am Hollywood JDT, and my co-host is none other than Stuntman Kirk. How you doing, man?
Doing well, sir. Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. This is our first actual episode that we've taped side by side, sitting in the same area, so it's a little bit weird.
It is. I'm used to just doing this either on Skype or on Bluetooth on my car. So it's going to be interesting. We're actually on our way home from Colorado Springs Comic-Con. So let's get started.
All right, well, let's jump into it. We were talking just a little bit ago. We wanted to get into talking about the Marvel-Sony split. So let's start off with that. I know we got different viewpoints on it, but what is your overall thought?
So here's my feeling. Back in the 90s, I think it was the late 90s, Marvel sold the rights to Spider-Man to Sony for, I think, $250,000. This was at a time when Marvel was not doing very well financially. I think they had filed for bankruptcy. They had licensed out most of their properties, like the X-Men, Spider-Man, those characters, out to other studios to make their movies for what was at the time, and even now today, a very, very relatively small price. And then obviously Sony made, I guess it would have been 5 Spider-Man movies prior to approaching Marvel about doing a rebooted Spider-Man following the Andrew Garfield series that would take place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Marvel was obviously very keen on this, so they obviously talked to Sony and were able to come to an agreement, which I've kind of been reading about over the last few days, that Marvel would have 5% of the first gross of any box office for Spider-Man. Right. And Kevin Feige, I think that's how you say it, Feige, he's the producer of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, would have creative control over Spider-Man, but Sony would put up all the money and receive all the revenue from the remaining of the box office. This agreement worked for, I think it amounted to 5 movies. We had Civil War, Captain America Civil War, Spider-Man Homecoming, Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, and Spider-Man Far From Home. All obviously very, very successful films, not necessarily as far as Marvel's end, because they included Spider-Man. The last Spider-Man movie was the first one, Spider-Man Far From Home, to make $1 billion at the box office, so it's natural that Sony and Marvel would want to sit down and discuss that, because that's quite a bit of money. Allegedly, Marvel came to the table wanting to co-finance, I guess, the Spider-Man films, but at the same time take back 50% of the box office. Sony didn't appreciate this, didn't care for this, felt like Marvel was overstepping their bounds, and didn't even come back with a counteroffer or another suggestion or anything like that. So news broke this week that Spider-Man will no longer be part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's still some questions, I guess, some speculation as to what that exactly means for Tom Holland, who's been playing Peter Parker Spider-Man for the last 5 movies, and what they are able to do as far as continuing the storyline where they left off at from Far From Home. So my opinion on it, and I think we've talked about it, is that they had an agreement in place that worked for both sides completely. Marvel was able to take in quite a bit of money from a movie they weren't really producing, as well as have complete creative control over a character that they had licensed out to another studio, whereas Sony got the benefit of being able to have their Spider-Man be part of the Marvel Universe whole and get their, I guess, reap the benefits of that. In my opinion, and talking to you, we both kind of agree Far From Home probably did as well as it did because it was the follow-up to Avengers Endgame, which, of course, is the highest-grossing movie now of all time. So my feeling was, and my feeling continues to be, that the agreement was fine in place. Why did there have to be any adjustment or any kind of negotiating as far as that goes? Because to me, they're both benefiting from it. Now, we've discussed and we both agree that Marvel doesn't need Spider-Man probably as much as Sony needs Marvel to assist, but at the same time, I mean, it's not like Sony wasn't having successful Spider-Man movies prior to Marvel's, I guess, inclusion. They were doing pretty well. Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man 2 movie that didn't do as well as they had hoped, notwithstanding. So my feeling is that I thought the agreement was fine. I thought it was mutually beneficial. I don't think Marvel really needs Spider-Man that much that they needed to come to the table asking for 50%. And to me, I just feel like this is really just going to hurt the fans long term because Spider-Man does better. He's more interesting when he's playing off the other Marvel characters, especially with Marvel Studios getting control now of the X-Men franchises, as well as Fantastic Four. A lot of storylines they could have done there, a lot of characters they could have included in the Spider-Man universe, vice versa. So I'm disappointed as a fan. I feel like they could have just kept the agreement as it was, and I think it was working for both sides. And now we're, as fans, kind of screwed out of future Spider-Man Marvel movies.
Well, and I think there's a lot to think about with it. And this is where I disagree with you, because I don't think there's anything wrong business-wise with Disney, Marvel coming to them and saying, hey, we want to relook at this agreement. We just hit the $1 billion mark. That was part of the other agreement. That had they not hit $1 billion, Sony was out of the agreement on the spot, but Disney hits it, or they hit it because of that. And I don't think there's any argument it was because of Disney and because of Marvel and the whole push behind it with Avengers. But I don't think there's anything wrong with them coming back to the table and saying, hey, we want to look at this. I mean, at this point, with the current, setup with Spider-Man, it is all part of Marvel at this point, and it has been Marvel that has built it and made it into what it in the current, one. And take away Andrew Garfield, take away Tobey Maguire, with Holland, that's all been Marvel, and Sony's been able to, they've paid the finances for it to produce, the two standalone movies, but it really has been Marvel the whole way through with the promotional and with everything else and doing all the other work. That 5% is not much when you're talking the amount that movie made. Didn't need to be 50-50? No, but I mean, they were coming, I think, with a fair deal, at least to look at. And the fact that Sony said, nope, we're not even talking about it, like kick rocks, to me, that said Sony wanted out of the deal. And they wanted to have an issue to be able to get out of it with it. And that's my feeling, because now they're coming back in with a Sony re-release of it to kind of, with a few more, minutes of footage and doing all that to kind of pick up more money. But I do think that a lot of it was, I think Sony's just as wrong with this, and if anything, I think Sony for not even coming back to the table with it, let's at least look at something here, even meeting in the middle of that request, or somewhere, even if it became 10%. The fact that there was no counter even made, I think puts Sony in a bad light in this. And I think at the end of it, with the fans, Sony's going to be the one that lose, because all Disney asked for was, hey, let's talk about it, doing a different agreement, more movies, more stuff and everything with it. And they said, they kicked rocks. And to that, it's the fans that are going to suffer, the fans that are hurting from it. They're the ones that are going to miss those opportunities. Now, there is rumors out there. It hasn't been on anything big, but it's picked up a little bit of steam that, this is kind of a publicity stunt, and at D3 or D23 coming up in this next weekend, that they're going to have, announce like a whole new setup and agreement with them. Who knows if that's true or not. Obviously, Holland's not happy about this issue with Sony, and that's the point that, it's 2019. How you say you're unhappy with something is you unfriend them. He unfriended him on Instagram and that to kind of cut that tie. And I do think that definitely says, where he sits with it. And I know he's under contract and he might not have a choice but to do more movies, but he could easily say, no, I'm done, I'm not doing it, and kind of bail out if he, depending on how that contract looks. But I think at the end of it, overall, it wasn't a bad request, and I don't think it's wrong to look at redoing that agreement. That's a business decision. Obviously, Disney and Marvel didn't felt like it wasn't working best for them in that, even though they were getting some kickback off of it. But I feel like, there was more to look at with it.
Well, so let's look at it this way. So I think from what I read, Spider-Man Far From Home cost about $150 million to make. And I'm not counting marketing. I know a lot of people want to throw that in there and stuff. Let's just throw that off. I think the budget was around $150 million. So let's say, now it made almost $2 billion at the box office. So what Sony was asking for was, what Marvel and Disney were asking for was 50% of the financing of it and 50% of the box office gross. That's what's been reported, or whatever you want to call it.
The rumor of the deal.
I don't think anyone's really commented officially on it, so I don't know if we know for sure if it was 50-50, but let's just say it was 50%, just because that seems to be the prevalent number going around. So you're asking Sony, who rightfully bought the rights to Spider-Man back in the 90s, whether we could argue, well, that was a different time or whatever. The fact is they legally purchased those rights, and they've been producing Spider-Man movies for almost 20 years now, to varying degrees of success. But regardless, they own the rights to produce Spider-Man movies. What you're asking Sony to do after everything is, okay, instead of you spending $150 million and getting, let's say, I don't know what, I'm in law enforcement, so I don't know math, but 5% of $1.2 billion versus, okay, well, now you're going to pay $75 million to produce the movie, but we're basically going to get about $600 million of the box office, and you're only going to get $600 million. Of course, you're saying it's a business side of it on Disney's end that they should. Well, on Sony's end, it's like, why would I if I only have to spend $75 million more to get 600 or 500 million more dollars, for the only real viable franchise that we have right now that works for us and has been the only thing that's really been successful for us, really outside of probably Ghostbusters and Men in Black, then of course they're going to scoff of that. And you say that Disney, or you felt that Sony was looking for an excuse to get out of the deal. Well, I kind of feel like maybe Marvel was looking for the exact same thing, because obviously Marvel, for those who don't know or don't know how it works out, Sony, used to have all the rights to produce Spider-Man, both cartoons and Spider-Man live-action movies. About 10 years ago or so, maybe a little bit more than 10 years ago, Sony and Marvel sat at the table and renegotiated that deal where Sony got all the, live action rights to movies and animated feature films, where Disney got all the rights to the animated series and television shows. So, for me, obviously Disney in this whole deal, this whole situation, would want to have Spider-Man completely back in the fold, just like they wanted X-Men back. That's why they wanted Fantastic Four. I'm not saying that's the sole reason why they bought Fox, but it was obviously one of the primary reasons why they bought Fox. So, I'm looking at it both ends. If we're really going to break it down, then of course both entities want to make as much money as possible, and both want as much control over the character of Spider-Man as possible. But at the end of the day, when we started with this deal, we had an agreement between both parties that was really the first, from considering how big these corporations are, was probably the most fan-friendly deal I've ever seen made, in the fact that Marvel was willing to assist Sony with the creative process of Spider-Man, just in exchange for allowing them to have Spider-Man in their universe. Like I said, that was a win-win for, I think, everyone. And then on top of that, we find out later on that Sony was even throwing a little bit of the box office to to Marvel's way. I would argue as well, let's be fair about this. Spider-Man was in Civil War, Spider-Man was in Endgame, Spider-Man was in Infinity War, and I'm not saying that those movies wouldn't have been as successful without Spider-Man. I'm sure they probably would have been. But I mean, Marvel benefited almost exclusively from those movies, or Spider-Man appearing in those movies, because they didn't kick anything back to Sony as far as box office gross for that. So I'm of the mindset that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It was working. You were getting a little bit of a kickback for it. Marvel and Disney is doing so successful right now with everything they got going on. I don't think they needed to come to the table with 50%. I think coming at it at 50% kind of would turn any other partner or any other negotiating partner off to wanting to renegotiate or discuss it any further. I think we are on the same page, though, that I really do believe at some point cooler heads are going to prevail and they're going to come to a new agreement.
No, and I agree. And I do think that, if Spider-Man had any influence on any of the other Avenger movies that he was in, it was nowhere near the level that the Marvel Avengers Endgame and that story had on Far From Home.
Well, for Far From Home, sure. But let's also remember Homecoming was made for about $140 million and only brought in about the same amount that the first Spider-Man movie brought. And that's not even adjusting for inflation. So, and that had Iron Man in it. And Robert Downey Jr., Tony Stark, that was heavily kind of connected to the Marvel Universe. So, to me, like I said, I just feel that there was a good deal in place that was really beneficial to the fans. And the only people who are really going to lose on this is not going to be Sony, because Sony's still going to make $1 billion for a Spider-Man movie. Marvel's still going to be able to make billion-dollar movies at the box office without Spider-Man being part of their universe. Really, who loses out are the fans, because, like I said, X-Men, Fantastic Four are now in the Marvel fold, and we're not going to see those characters interact in the future if there's not a new deal made.
See, but I think you almost proved my point on it by saying, Far From Home was not a box office smash. Didn't blow up the box office.
You mean Homecoming?
Homecoming,
yeah.
Sorry. Did not just completely blow up the box office. It was good, and it did well. It made the money it needed to make.
Well, at $800 million, let's not.
Right.
It's not chump change
right,
here.
It's not. But it's nowhere near the, Far From Home setup on there. And I think there was enough interest in it where people were like, okay, let's see how they do with it. Let's see what happens here. And people liked what they saw. Some of the backlash was there was so much Tony Stark and, some of that. But I think a lot of that, like we've talked in the past, was, fans like you tied into the old, to the old movies, not liking some of that difference.
Well, and it's, I've said this before. So they didn't do the Spider-Man origin with the Marvel Spider-Man for good reason. They had just done it with Tobey Maguire. They did it with Andrew Garfield. They weren't going to go through, shooting Uncle Ben again and, having go through all that. So they kind of made Tony Stark, I guess, the de facto Uncle Ben of the Marvel Spider-Man, which, I have reservations about because I'm a huge comic book fan. I've been reading Spider-Man comic books for several years. And while Tony Stark and Spider-Man do have a relationship in the comic books, it's not that kind of relationship. So to me, they kind of went overboard with, I said this when we talked about it, and Homecoming, the Vulture in Adrian Toomes was really trying to get revenge on Tony Stark, and Spider-Man happened to get in the way. It was the same thing with Mysterio in Spider-Man Far From Home. So I didn't have, I guess, a huge problem with it because the creative decision was, hey, we're going to play our Spider-Man off of Tony Stark because that's how we're setting it up. So it just made sense that way. So for storyline purposes, I got the logic behind it. I just felt like at some point they needed to move away from that and make Spider-Man kind of his own hero. Kind of how he's depicted in the comic books and how he's also depicted in the other Spider-Man films.
Right. And I'm not disagreeing with you on any of that. But what I think is Homecoming was kind of that coming out, resetting up this version of Spider-Man, this view of Spider-Man and the story that they were building. Then you have the big Avengers, you have the Infinity War, you have Endgame, these huge stories, and really Homecoming, or Far From Home, was almost really a conclusion to that, to kind of let you know how everybody settled a little bit there, or at least some of those characters, and to kind of see where that set up at. That I don't think anyone can say that movie makes $1 billion without Infinity War.
Well, no, and we talked about that. No, right. But where would they be? Hold
on. But I think that, it's not wrong for Disney to look at it and say, look, you were making this with the Garfield series. You weren't bringing in this much money in your box office for them. And
they weren't really good films to begin with, but
right.
That's a different
discussion. That's different. but even more, who made them? Who wrote them? Who produced them?
Fair.
It was all under Sony.
It was all. Yep.
Sony had control of it, and it didn't make the money that they did. So to me, I see it as Sony being more greedy with it, being like, no, we're not sharing anything right now, because I think, and I'll take back maybe Sony wanted out of the deal. I think Sony was like, nope, we have a deal in place, and we're not changing it, and hoping that it was just kind of go that way, because if the next Spider-Man movie makes $1 billion, well, that's just more money for them to keep going for a while. Where Disney, looking at half of that $1 billion isn't going to hurt Sony to, in that big scheme of it, if they're only fronting the half in, when it's really Marvel doing the legwork. All Sony did, if anything, Sony's more, to me, just reaping the benefits, because they're not doing anything. They
paid for the movie, though.
Right. They paid for the movie, but who wrote the movie? Who made it good? Who made it?
I get that.
Who put the back behind it?
And like I said, there was
a story behind it.
There's a way you can discuss that, negotiate that. Okay, let's make this a little bit more palatable for both sides.
We obviously weren't in those discussions.
No,
we weren't there. We're just hearing the rumor that came out of it. I don't think it was a phone call that was like, hey, 50% of everything both ways, or we're out. I think it was, hey, we want to look at, going off at least what I read, it was, hey, reaching out, would you guys be interested in this kind of deal? And Sony really balked at it and kind of flipped them off in that sense. And it was like, okay, you know what? We don't want to do this anymore. And yeah, Disney and Marvel might have been the ones to pull the plug, or, Feige, or however you say his name.
Feige, I think. I hate to say it. I know how to spell it, everyone who's listening right now, and you're probably going to be like, you guys are morons not being able to know. I mean, I literally have never heard his name in an interview or anything. No one ever really mentioned it. So I just know him, and I know what the name is. I can't figure out how to pronounce it. So I apologize in advance.
Let's just say KF.
Or Kevin, I guess. We know how to pronounce that.
He pulled out of it like, hey, I'm not doing this, and I'm not going to produce the next ones. And if I'd see Disney being like, well, if he's not going to produce the next one with the Marvel stuff, we're not going to push him into our, world at that point. So,
but we're talking about what is really going to amount to $600 million.
Exactly.
But that's what I'm saying is, why would Sony, as a business, be able to express that to stockholders that, hey, we're going to give up, we're going to drop our costs $75 million, but we're also going to lose $600 million because we're going to split the cost. That no matter how you slice it, if that's really what the deal Marvel came at with Sony, that just does not make any sense. That's why...
Right, but that's why you do negotiations. You come in at a deal a little bit higher than probably where you're really wanting to sit in at, and that no negotiation is ever... You bought a house, you don't negotiate with, this is the only number I want to match at. You come a little lower and hope they're going to come up to probably where you feel comfortable paying it most. But I think that's where it's at. Sony balked at it. They didn't want to negotiate at all, from what it sounds like. And that's their part of the deal. They have that right to. They own the Spider-Man character at this point. No one's saying that was wrong how they got him. But I just think that, Sony's wrong to not also look at it. And I think, honestly, wrong to not look at the big picture, because I think if they pull out, if Sony makes a Spider-Man movie on their own that has no Marvel tie-in to it, and you can guarantee that Disney and Marvel will be on their butt about it, if there's any kind of hint on Marvel stuff, they'll be on it to, yank that movie and, come at them with soup. But if they don't have that, the very next movie might do really well in the box office because people are going to want to see how it is. But any follow-up after that, it's either going to be another reboot that they're going to have to do, or it's going to be, it's going to tank. And I think ultimately they're going to wind up probably making half of that or less by, just not having Marvel behind it in the story writing aspect of it, and they're not going to be able to carry it.
So the only caveat to all that, and the only, I guess, flaw in your statement there is Into the Spider-Verse. Now that was an animated film, mind you, made for a lot less money, and brought in, obviously, it did not bring in $1 billion at the box office. It was a highly successful film, but it wasn't obviously Far From Home numbers. But it is from what I understand, or from what I remember, nothing's changed, I don't think, with Far From Home. It is the best reviewed Spider-Man movie of all time, and was completely produced by Sony and written by Sony, and did very well. I saw it myself with my wife at the theater.
Hands down, a great movie.
So I if you're asking me, and then even going back, the Andrew Garfield films notwithstanding, and the third Tobey Maguire film, Sam Raimi film notwithstanding, Sony was able to make 2 amazing Spider-Man films, no pun intended, with Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2. So if you're asking me, do I feel like Sony is just going to be completely lost without Marvel and making a good Spider-Man movie? No. Even Amazing Spider-Man 2, which most consider to be, financially and critically the worst Spider-Man movie live action film of all time, still made over $700 million at the box office. But so I guess for me, I would just, if I was Sony, we're talking $500-600 million at stake, I'd roll the dice that I would just be able to creatively figure it out with a character like Spider-Man, all the stories and history he has, and without being tied in, that none of them or most of them aren't tied into the Marvel universe as a whole, versus feeling dependent upon Disney to have to produce a good Spider-Man film.
And I'm all for Sony believing that. I think Sony will realize that they're wrong out of it, and I'm willing to bet you, and we can mark it down on the board, I'm willing to bet that at some point this agreement gets remade in a much more balanced thing where you will see it more than a 5% income.
Well, and I agree with you on that.
It's going to be truly a 50-50, everything's equal type thing, or even more, that Disney produces a little bit more of it at that point. But I'm willing to bet you that at some point in the next 5 years, we'll go with, Spider-Man's back underneath Marvel and owned by Marvel Disney.
Well,
and probably Sony Pictures and all with the way Disney's going. Who knows? But
well, I think my feeling is I don't think it's going to be half and half for sure. I think it's going to be a little bit more reasonable, a little bit more logical. I think you're talking maybe 90-10 split of the box office gross. But we'll see, because from what Sony has stated and from what has been relayed, it sounds like Sony's heart is steadfast, clear that they don't want to revisit the offer. So whatever they had in place before was totally fine with Sony. They don't want to change that. Again, I get it. You're talking again, if it is half, $500 million, I certainly wouldn't give that up regardless of how rich I was. And Sony's not nearly as well off as a studio as Disney, Marvel, Fox, all the half the freaking movie studios on the planet Earth, apparently, that Disney now owns. So for them, their cash cow now is Spider-Man. Men in Black, their international did not do very well at the box office without Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, if that's the reason why, which I think it was. And then Ghostbusters, a couple years back, did not do very well for them at the box office, and now they're rebooting Ghostbusters again, sort of. So for Sony, Spider-Man's their only legitimate cash cow, and they got to keep that going as much as possible. So that's all I got to say about that. I think we kind of beat that horse a little bit longer than we expected, but it's good conversation. It's good to follow, to see where they go with it. I think you and I are both in agreement, though, that at some point a more reasonable agreement will be made between the two sides.
I agree, because at this point, it's only the fans that are going to be hurting in the long run. So, all right, guys, this has been a special edition. We wanted to talk just some Sony on there with that. We will have more coming up to you guys. We're going to talk some wrestling. We're going to talk some Broncos, I'm sure, and some more sports. This has been the show. We will catch you guys later.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Show with Hollywood JDT and Stuntman Kirk. Want to stay in the know on all things sports, wrestling, movies, and TV? Follow the show on social media at The Show Podcast. If you like today's episode, please leave a review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on The Show.
Post-traumatic stress is not a disorder. It's an injury that can be healed. Each week on the Life After PTSD, podcast stories are told of counselors and clients who are creating a new normal of their choosing, truly free of trauma and PTSD. Listen for yourself on iTunes and all major platforms by searching Life After PTSD.